Okay, we're starting chapter 5 today, and it's similar to what we just went over. In chapter 4, we did colonial societies throughout like the 17th century. That's the 1600s. Remember, Jamestown starts in 1607, so that period, that beginning period. Today in chapter 5, and today and tomorrow, we're going to be looking at colonial society, but more towards the 18th century, into the 1700s. We're getting closer to that revolutionary time period, and why we're going to be looking at, like, why do they want to rebel, what would be the reasons for that. And so that's where you're going to be like, what are we starting to see seeds of resentment or things like that. The population in the colonies really just gets huge comparatively to what is happening in England. It's a young country. Most of the people are teenagers or in their 20s, and most people live in rural areas. So people are not living in cities. They're out there with their land. They're doing farming, all of that you would imagine. Mostly English people, but there are other people. Remember, we talked about Pennsylvania. They talked about people coming through, and like the Dutch and the Germans and whatever. So you do have other segments, and that's something to think about. So you have the Germans are about 6% of the population. Of course, they're coming over for different reasons, but they don't have any loyalty to the British Crown. You also have the Scotch-Irish people who are coming over, who've had a long history, right? I don't know if y'all have ever watched Outlander. If you ever watched that on Starz, that is kind of the idea here. Like, they are constantly fighting with those people in England, so there's not a lot of loyalty with those people either. And these people, the Scotch-Irish people, are going to be more of your frontiersmen, the people on the outskirts, and that's going to cause some issues too. So we do start to see a little bit these seeds of rebellion, right? So the first one are the Scotch-Irish, or the Paxton Boys. In 1764, they march on Philadelphia for the same reasons we see in like Bacon's Rebellion, right? They think that the people in Philadelphia are too lenient on the Native Americans, because guess what? The people on the West are the ones fighting the Native Americans, and they really wanted some help. Same thing with the regulator movement that happens in North Carolina, closer to that time of the Revolutionary period. They're also protesting like unfair taxation and just those East Coast elites compared to these people who are out here living on the edges, right? So you start seeing this theme, right, of this West and East Coast elite versus frontier, things like that. Then you have lots of other multicultural people out there. You have the French Huguenots, who are French Protestants. You have the Welsh, the Dutch, who we've talked about, the Swedes, Jews. You have Irish and Swiss. You have just all kinds of Western Europeans that are kind of spread throughout these areas. So the biggest non-white English group, of course, were Africans at the time. And slavery really grows fast throughout this 18th century, right, and it really into the 19th century as these crops really take off, right? We talked about earlier, like, it was just doing good to get people to stay alive. Well, we've worked that out, right? Population's growing, and slavery's there, and these staple crops, particularly in the South, are really becoming important. In the Deep South, slavery's everywhere, it's through all the colonies, but in the Deep South, it's really rooted. The climate there's really awful. The plantations are far apart. There's nobody to be there. In the Deep South, like South Carolina, they're having to continually import slaves at this point to really continue, because people are living and dying on those plantations. In the Chesapeake region, that's Virginia and Maryland, slavery is also entrenched there too, but tobacco is less physically demanding than the rice and the indigo. The plantations are larger, they're older, closer together, so there is some sort of type of community there. And in those areas, the diseases are kind of waning, and so you have more of reproduction, so slavery begins to grow through reproduction. Slavery exists north of those areas too, but in much smaller numbers. You have people in New Jersey and New York working in agriculture, but in other places you have them working in cities, right, for manufacturing or for artisans in those areas. There really did become an increase of native-born slaves. And so you do get more of a mix of what you would see, kind of an African-American culture begins during that period. There are already some seeds of revolts, right? We know at the end of our class, we'll be talking about the Civil War, but all the way back in this early 1700 period, already some issues. In 1712, there's a slave revolt. In 1739, there's one in South Carolina, and you'll get to see some information about that. The structure of society, we kind of talked about that. It's a little different than England. It's not near as aristocratic, although there are some who wish it were. There are wealth, right? And depending where you live in the north, it's really merchants or tradespeople. In the south, of course, it's these plantation owners who really hold most of the wealth. And then you do have some growth, right, from these old indentured servants who end up climbing up this ladder and all of this, and that exists. It exists for everyone except for the slaves, and you'll see how that kind of moves into it. They talked about the most honored profession. You know, we're looking at most people are farmers, like most people. And then you have, you know, ministers. That was the most honored profession of the time. You do have doctors and lawyers. Doctors, though, are very ill-trained. You know, this epidemics like smallpox and things like that are like their worst fear. And we're not to all the scientific explosions that we'll get throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Lawyers were not esteemed. They were, you know, people were like, I can just argue my own case, right? We have this idea of equality there, and so you see that. And it really wasn't until the Revolutionary period, like John Adams was a lawyer, and that we start to see that become a more respectable profession. What were people doing? They're farming, right? That's what they're doing. Each area has different things that they farm. Even in the northern areas where that wasn't a place that made money, you know, they're still making money off building ships and trade and things like that. So people had to farm to eat, right? So you still had that. One specific thing you really need to think about is this idea of this triangular trade. There's a map in there that you'll get to see, but it's where, you know, you have all these ships built, particularly in the Northeast. They would leave a port there and they would take rum. They would take that to Africa and use the rum to buy slaves, take it back to the West Indies, and in there they would get the sugar from the sugar plantations, and they would go back up to New England or to the American colonies, and that's where you would take that sugar and make it into rum, right? So you can see that there at the triangular trade. We do, because of that trade system, there are, the American colonies are growing faster than the English colonies, and there's only so much things that we can sell and buy, right? So eventually Americans, you know, are trading with other people, particularly the French in the West Indies. And so they become, the English become upset about that, and you'll see that they'll have some acts, some laws that they pass in response to that, which is really going to be what gets us onto that road to the revolution. So today that you'll have to go through all that content I just talked about, and then you will look at a document that kind of compares and contrasts the colonies themselves. It has some maps. It's not easy to read. Just do your best. You'll have to open it up with Cami if you can't remember how to do that. We talked about it last week. You can go back and look at that and see how to do it. If you have any questions, of course, you can email me at abain@jeffcoed.com.